Well, Ben, have you ever heard of World War II?
You know, I think we should start the show.
Oh, you see, this is one of my frustrations.
About our show?
Well, just working with you. Is you're insistent on, doing things by the book.
Right. I am a very materialistic person, and books are material.
Right.
So I tend to go by the material in the books.
Yeah.
Out of my materialistic nature.
You're just a consumer.
Pretty much.
I feel like the first couple minutes of the show is always an exercise in getting people to stop listening before
it's too late.
Before it's too late. So we kind of like, I like to front load it with the most offensive stuff, and then they just go ahead and save themselves the trauma of listening to the next 20, 30 minutes.
Where's David when you need him?
But anyway, this podcast...
This is Obscurigami.
Yes, and
the only one in the world.
I'm your host, Thomas.
I'm not your host, but I'm a host. I don't like to think of myself as yours.
I'm the creator, founder, and hoster of the Obscurigami podcast, obscurigami.com, Thomas Flake, excuse me.
Can't say your last name on the internet.
Yeah.
And I'm Ben, and I'm here, depending on where you're listening to this.
Ben is technically also the co-founder, creator, and author of
but I would say you're
Academy
definitely the
Award-winning
senior partner.
podcast. I don't know if I'm the
in terms
senior
of
partner. Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's
Well, when we have to divide up the subscribers,
right.
If it's an odd number, I'll take the extra one.
In the divorce, I think you'll probably get the dog.
All right.
So what do we have cooking today?
Okay, so a little pop quiz. Do you know where the only land battle that was fought on U.S. territory during World War II took place?
I would assume the Philippines or somewhere like that.
I should specify incorporated U.S. territory. I don't know that that's actually gonna help you get the answer, but I'm just saying
meaning there may have been lower 48.
There may have been. It happened in incorporated United States of America territory. There was one land battle.
I do not know the answer to this question.
Well, good, because if you had, then I would have been like, maybe it's not very obscure, but it's mildly obscure. Not many people know about it. A battle happened there, and I'm going to talk about the place. Also the battle by proxy, but it's Attu Island in Alaska.
Attu Island?
Attu Island is part of the Aleutian Islands.
How do you spell Attu?
Attu is spelled A-T-T-U.
A-T-T-U.
A-T-T-U, yes. And if you're imagining a map of Alaska in your mind, that kind of little peninsula, that tail of islands that kind of come out off of the peninsula, Attu is the westernmost island. Attu, it's the westernmost, and it is the largest island of the near island group of the Aleutian Islands, which is the name of that group there. And it's the westernmost point of land in the United States relative to Alaska.
Wow.
As I already mentioned, the only World War II land battle fought on U.S. incorporated territory happened there. The next island to the west of Attu Island is the Russian Commander Islands. It's just 208 miles away. But Attu is nearly 1,000 miles from Alaskan mainland.
Oh, wow.
And it is...
Do people live on Attu?
People, yes. Well, not currently.
Okay.
It's currently uninhabited.
How big is it?
It is the 23rd largest island in the U.S. So it's actually quite big. It's 344 square miles.
Okay.
So it's not huge. There are no native trees on it. If you look at pictures of it, it's mostly kind of like small mountainy hills. And, there's usually patchy snow a lot of months of the year. It basically has, from what I've determined, probably the worst weather anywhere. It's
Anywhere
mostly
in the
rainy,
universe.
foggy, cloudy, and only has about 8 or 10 clear sunny days a year.
Wow.
The only trees on the island were ones that were planted there in 1943 around a chapel. A 2010 census had the population at 10, but all those people lived at a Coast Guard station that closed in 2010, and it's been uninhabited since
that
then.
Time.
It was first discovered, not originally discovered, obviously, because there was natives there, but first discovered by kind of Western countries in...
You say native peoples. Were there actually native peoples that lived on Attu?
Yeah, so when it was discovered by Russian merchants, Russian traders, discovery was in 1742. There were about 150 to 200 people living on the island, native Aleuts. And there's people who live throughout the Aleutian Islands on the chain of islands that
right,
come
part
off
of the same people group.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like there was one isolated people group that lived there.
Right.
Or like one tribe. It was more like there was a group of lots of people that inhabited the islands. Kind of like the Polynesians.
Right. And so there would have been people who lived there when it was found, like I said, 150, 200 people. But archaeology shows that there may have been 20 times that at some point. So several thousand people may have lived on the island kind of at most in history. After the discovery in the 1700s, the Russian traders would kind of stay there for a while, hunting sea otters, mainly it seemed like. And then they kind of left eventually. Mm-hmm. And the Aleutians were the primary inhabitants until June 7th, 1942, 6 months after the U.S. joined the war. And the 301st Independent Infantry Battalion of Japanese Northern Army landed on the island without opposition. So there was, in 1942, there was about 45 native Aleuts and Aleutians and 2 Americans living on the island. The 2 Americans were, I have their names here, Charles Foster Jones and his wife, Etta, and they were there on kind of on a teaching assignment. I'm assuming by the government. I wasn't really able to determine through what organization, but they had been through several locations throughout Alaska to native villages teaching. They ended up in Attu, was their last stop. They were there, and Japan descended on the island and kind of overtook them. All 45 natives and the 2 Americans ended up being taken out to Japanese POW camps where quite a few of them died. I think 12 died, and they were held there till the end of the war. But it was an interesting movement. The Japanese intended to hold portions of the island because they were afraid they would be used tactically by the U.S. Mm-hmm. The U.S. was kind of not really paying attention to what was going on, mm-hmm. Had nobody on the islands.
What was the distance? You said it was like 200 miles from the nearest Russian island.
200 miles from the nearest Russian island. I'm not sure what the distance would be from Japan or the Japanese islands, but I know they had occupancy of some nearby islands.
Right. And
it couldn't have been that far based on some things that I'll get to in a second. But
would it... I assume because of its size, it wasn't really feasible to set up a base.
There actually were bases established there, including a runway. Later, the U.S. established kind of an air base there.
Okay.
So it wasn't, I mean, it was definitely usable as a strategic point. The U.S. didn't seem to have any plan of doing that, but once the Japanese moved in there, the U.S. kind of realized what was going on. They evacuated over 800 people from the rest of the Aleutian Islands and moved them off to civilian camps in mainland, the peninsula of Alaska, a lot of those people actually ended up dying as well, just from like sickness, and it was kind of bad
from being transferred to a
conditions.
New environment.
Yeah, just being there was
there very poor government housing?
I don't know that it was necessarily like, I didn't research that too heavily. I don't know that it was necessarily like neglect or negligence so much as just like a lot of these people were natives who had lived on the islands, and then they were kind of like crammed together into these camps, and so disease and stuff like that was a lot more, or became kind of prevalent. I think it was just rougher conditions. So the Japanese had a few objectives in attempting to take the island. They were hoping to break up any of existing offensives that were there. Turned out there weren't any. They also wanted to kind of put a little barrier there between the U.S. and Russia, and just so that those islands couldn't be used. And then they also wanted to establish a base that they could later use for offensives against the U.S.
Because Russia and Japan at this time were not particularly friendly either.
Right. Yeah.
So one of their objectives was not to try and conquer mainland Alaska then?
That's unclear.
Right. Maybe long term.
Yeah.
But there was no like direct.
But yeah, it was definitely a move towards, establishing. They meant to establish a base there that they could have used then for air attacks later on.
Right.
So I think it was a step in that direction. They don't get very far though, because the U.S. was able to halt any reinforcements coming to the area. They used naval attacks to target any reinforcements or supplies that were coming to the island, and eventually the Japanese were forced to use only submarines to resupply to avoid interception, and so they weren't able to reinforce the existing troops there. And I believe they had about several thousand, over 2,500 people roughly, or the initial garrison was 500, and then through reinforcements they raised it up to over 2,000.
Wow.
As of March 10th in 1943. So they kind of dug in there and established a little base in the bay, and had a garrison. The U.S. was able to kind of cut things off, and they made an attempt in May of 1943 to take it back. They moved a bunch of troops onto the island, but conditions were so terrible. It was very cold, and there was a lot of frostbite, and it was just pretty bad. They lost a lot of people just to the conditions itself. Without the Japanese kind of moved up into the hills, holed up in caves and little encampments and trenches and stuff, and created these booby traps, and it was just kind of this incredibly messy situation where they were kind of dug in there against each other.
About how many troops did
there
you say
were
the U.S. put in?
3,992. Wait, hold on. There ended up being in that initial. It lists how many U.S. casualties there were, but not how many troops they landed. 17th Infantry, the 7th Infantry Division, made amphibious landings. It does not say how many. I'm sure someone could figure that out.
It's interesting that they chose to land troops as opposed to just striking at them from the air.
Right.
It seems like
because there were no natives there.
And they had total air power since the Japanese weren't able to supply drop.
Yeah.
So I would think they would just try to bomb it, but maybe the terrain.
The terrain might have made it difficult. I mean, it was also a pretty good number of Japanese kind of scattered throughout the island as a whole, and a target of 230 some square miles, is a pretty large area to try to hit if you can't see where people are and they're kind of scattered about and dug in. And I think they realized once the Japanese were trying to take the area, the U.S. decided to establish itself there. So they didn't want to just, push back. They also wanted to establish control. So the initial fighting was pretty brutal. There were 3,929 U.S. casualties including injuries. There was 1,200 injuries just from the severe cold, 600 just from disease, and then there was like 318, this is U.S., that died or that were injured or died from booby traps and friendly fire. So it was just this big mess of a battle. The Japanese were assembling a fleet in Tokyo Bay to send up to kind of reinforce and help with this battle. They had like 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 11 destroyers, and some other sundry stuff. So they were like quite serious about trying to make this happen. But before they were able to do that, the U.S. kind of pushed the remaining Japanese soldiers up into a corner and were able to kind of take the bay area that they had been holding. The Japanese garrison had only managed to really like hold a bay. Still a few thousand of them left. They kind of pushed them back into a corner, managed to take the bay, and the Japanese colonel, he led the largest banzai attack of the Pacific theater. Wow. And they rushed down onto the U.S. forces, and they penetrated so far in that there was like army officers in tents at the back at like the rear of the encampment that were like suddenly surprised by Japanese soldiers like upon them, and there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. Mm-hmm. And only 28 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, and there were 2,351 casualties, quite a few U.S. casualties as well.
Yeah, that's typical of the Japanese in the Pacific theater.
After that, the remaining any Japanese forces that were still on the island who had not been involved in the attack evacuated or retreated onto a neighboring island that the Japanese had also taken hold of that wasn't under U.S. It wasn't occupied prior to the Japanese occupation of Kiska, and they just kind of emptied out of Attu, and the U.S. just at that point kind of moved in, and they set up their garrison, set up camp, and kind of camped there for the rest of the war, and eventually built an airstrip, and it would later become a Coast Guard. There would be a Navy town and an airfield there for quite a while. That would eventually become the Coast Guard station that eventually closed. At this point, it's mostly a wildlife preserve, but a lot of the island is kind of like just like covered in this. It's kind of because it has so few inhabitants, there's so little activity on it. A lot of it is still kind of scarred and covered with the remnants of the fight, the battle, and the war, or the battle that took place there. There's just like downed plains and like old, just a lot of the
debris of battle.
Debris of battle is still there, was never cleaned up. So it's starting to, like in the last few years, a lot of the remnants of war, relics of war from World War II are just starting to kind of be considered of like significant historical value or like worth saving. All that stuff previously had just been left untouched because nobody had a reason to do anything about it, but now it's kind of starting to move into the realm of like wanting to be preserved for potential historic
I would think
purposes.
That the severe weather, particularly a lot of rain and snow, whatnot, would deteriorate the debris and the remains faster.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything's in great condition,
right. But still preserved.
Right, but it's still fairly preserved. Or at least it's just preserved in the sense of stuff is degrading, but nobody's touched it.
Right.
And, you know, since it was left there however many years ago.
That's fascinating.
A lot of times. None of the natives who were taken as POWs or the 2 Americans ever returned to the island. It seems no non-military inhabitants or Coast Guard inhabitants ever lived there after the war. So the war kind of ended its time as a civilian occupied place. The only building that existed there prior to the war, there was a Orthodox church that was built there, which is where the trees were planted. That is like one of the only buildings that predated the war. So it's just kind of this interesting place where it's like very few people, like less than 200 people, kind of lived on this island for years and years and years. And then one day the Japanese come out of the hills, sweep everyone up, send them off to a POW camp. It becomes, you know, for the space of a year and a half, this site of a just bloody like battle.
Yeah.
Becomes a military base where a few people live for the next century almost, and then just turns into a wildlife refuge. I had never heard of the battle, or like in reading about it, there's a few documentaries made about it. There's some old like newsreels with actual footage of some of the fighting and troop movement and stuff that took place on the island. That's pretty interesting to watch, but it's one of the elements of the, you know, United States involvement in World War II that's fairly glossed over or forgotten, despite being like, people have described it as like Gettysburg type of like bloodshed. It's the bloodiest battle that's happened on American soil since the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting...
But I guess, yeah, that's fascinating. I guess because it's barely American soil.
Right. I mean, it's
about as far out as you can get.
It's the most...
The westernmost point.
It's the westernmost point. Yeah, it's not the westernmost. There's a weird thing where it's more eastern in time zone than I think Hawaii. But yeah, it's the westernmost point. I mean, it's much further. It's like 5, 6 or 7,000 miles from Washington D.C. So like, just in terms of like distance, it's you know,
it's pretty far out.
One of
there.
the most remote locations of the U.S. you could go to.
On a clear day, can you look out to the west and see the Russian island that's about 200 miles away? That would be pretty impressive.
I don't know. It probably depends on what the terrain of the Russian
island is. And
then
my follow-up question would be, does Sarah Palin have a house on Attu?
Not that we're aware of. Attu has been hailed as the a bird-watching holy grail of North America, because it has so many species of bird that aren't anywhere else in North America. And for a while, the competitive bird watching, which now that I say that might be a good follow-up topic, the competitive bird watching record holder, the idea being they would try to see as many different species of bird in like a several day period, a short period of time as possible. And
that was a sport that I did not know existed.
Yeah, the record for that was held by a guy who had the record on Attu.
Right.
And when they kind of shut it down and people couldn't really get there for a while, they thought that record wouldn't be able to be beaten by someone in North America. It was later beaten by someone else in a different location. But I thought that was an interesting bit.
Yeah, I wonder how well documented it was, his victory. He's out there in
apparently Attu is pretty, it's not obscure among the competitive birdwatching community.
Oh, of course.
Wikipedia noted that there was a movie about birdwatching with some A-list actor or somebody in it, B-list actor, where they go to Attu in the movie
to watch birds.
So apparently it's fairly well known in the birdwatching community.
Was it filmed on location?
I don't think so. Yeah, I imagine flying 1,000 miles off the coast of Alaska for some mushy, snowy mountains. The weather, literally, you look at like the chart for like the average, and like the record high is like 72 in like the dead of summer, and the average throughout the summer is like 40 to like 46 to like 50 degrees. Through the winter, it's like 20 to like 30 some degrees, and so it just it just like precipitates like 170 days out of the year.
Yeah.
And it just kind of constantly like stays in that range of like just cold enough for there to be snowfall, and then there's rain, and then snowfall, and then you get like 3 summer months where it's like...
But it's not extreme enough to like draw like the people who are drawn to areas where it's sub-zero temperatures.
Right. It's not extreme weather. It's not...
It's just just
like,
bad weather.
If you just imagine like the kind of weather that makes people like, ugh, like you don't want to get out of bed because it's just like, it's like soggy or like just like gross or like overcast and like muggy. Like that's what the weather is.
It's kind of like
that too.
Extreme Seattle or extreme London.
Yeah.
That kind of drizzle, constant, never ending wetness.
Attu is one of 10,000 formerly used defense sites in the nation, and the Department of Defense has about 250 million each year that they use to kind of slowly clean up some of the 2,700 sites that need cleaning.
Wow.
I just thought that was an interesting statistic that I came across. The DoD spends 250 million a year just kind of like slowly mopping up some of its mess that's left scattered throughout the nation.
Wow. Sounds fiscally responsible.
The story of the 2 non-natives who were taken to the POW camps are pretty interesting. There's a book of letters from Etta Jones to one of her relations in America.
I take it they were not among the 12 that died?
No, they survived. And the reports are pretty kindly towards the Japanese. All the natives and the Americans felt like they were treated pretty fairly and nicely. They were
interesting.
The conditions were bad in the POW camps because they were just bad in the area at the time.
They were
there was shortages of food,
but there were no reports of torture and...
Yeah, there were shortages of food and supplies, but they said, that everyone was short on food and supplies. So it was traumatizing for them to be removed to a POW camp for 3 years, but it wasn't anywhere.
Was the POW camp, I assume, somewhere kind of far away?
It was in Japan.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. Reading kind of neutral historical accounts of the battle kind of gave me one impression, and then when I stumbled across the newsreels and some of the footage that came back through the U.S. military, it was really interesting to see like how propagandistic it was. They show some of the kind of the harsh conditions, but things are painted in like a fairly positive light. Like the U.S. was doing pretty well there,
right?
And
which I guess ultimately they were, but
ultimately they were successful. But when you're looking at like
ratio to the
300 people dying from like friendly fire and booby traps.
Yeah.
Well, not dying. The loss of life ratio was definitely a lot lower than the Japanese, but
also to
certainly
the strategic the ratio to the strategic nature of the island.
Right. Yeah.
Like it wasn't that valuable strategically.
Yeah. It would have been significant had the Japanese been able to hold position of it, but for the U.S. to have it was, not that big of a deal. They were mostly a cork in the bottle of the Japanese potentially ever being there again in the future. The Battle of Attu and Attu Island. That's what I got.
Bravo, sir. Good topic. Not an easy one. That covered a lot of ground.
If you search it on YouTube, there's some documentaries, and there's a video I found from the Alaskan National Park and Wildlife Service of some kind of dedication of some plaques that they put up on the island in 2013 to commemorate the battle, memorialize the battle.
Didn't the Coast Guard base leave in 2010?
Yes.
So who looks at the plaques?
It's a good question. That is a very good question. Yeah. My first, my initial reaction when I heard about this place was like, oh, I'd love, I want to go there. There's some, because there's some kind of weird, there would be some kind of weird sense of achievement in, going to the point of the United States incorporated territory that's like the furthest from basically everything else.
But it's so far out.
Yeah.
You almost can't.
And they only really go there by like boat because the airstrip isn't really maintained.
Gotcha.
So
well, why would you maintain it if there's nobody there?
Yeah. So I guess the National Park Service is going there. I mean, the Department of Defense has to kind of like take their mops out there and like spend a couple $1,000s. I saw pictures and people were talking about how like you can walk to different areas in the island and there's actually like you can step on the ground and there's like oil that'll like come out from the battle. It's just like so in the environment from all the leftovers. So
wow.
Yeah.
Well, once again,
it's that time of year. The winds and the rains and the snows of Attu are pounding against your little tent, and you've zipped shut the tent door.
The tent fly.
And you're kind of huddled up in the corner trying to get some warmth. And what can comfort you but the random Wikipedia article section of this podcast? Critics have rated it the worst reoccurring segment on a podcast in 2017.
Certified rotten on Rotten Tomatoes.
Academy Award winning then losing podcast segment.
Raspberry Award winning. Part of the show where we click on the random article button on Wikipedia and see what happens. So I'm just gonna do that now. Are you ready, Thomas?
Indeed.
Here we go. Today's Wikipedia article is Laurent Bavay.
This is a good one.
It's very short.
You want to do us the honors, Ben, and go ahead and just read this article?
I will actually read the whole article for you. Laurent Bavay, born 1972, is a Belgian Egyptologist who has been director of the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale since June 2015.
Glad we could mispronounce something there. I think the real question here is, what is an Egyptologist?
Someone who studies Egypt, specifically ancient Egypt, the science being a branch of archaeology.
Don't really know what I expected.
That does
it's a little on
stand
the nose.
To reason. Yeah, this Wikipedia article is a stub. You can help Wikipedia by expanding it. For example, you could tell us a little bit more about Laurent Bavay. You could tell us what some of his favorite foods are, what his favorite color is.
Ben, if people wanted to email us information about Laurent Bavay so that we could add it to Wikipedia and take the credit, how would they email us?
Probably they would send an email to our email address, obscurigami@gmail.com.
Sounds reasonable. You can also go to obscurigami.com for show notes and subscription links and other various and sundry other episodes.
Look at pictures of Attu Island.
Yeah, we'll throw a couple in there. Maybe one of Laurent Bavay if we can
swing it.
Excuse me, Laurent.
He looks like quite an enthusiastic character.
Egyptologist. I wonder if there's other tologists, like, do you have like an Englandologist?
Mm-hmm. An Attuologist. Which I believe you now are, because you've studied the island of Attu.
I've studied the island quite a bit.
In depth. He has an IMDb page. He plays himself in a documentary.
Japanologist.
He has a LinkedIn page.
Russianologist.
Probably oh no, this isn't the same Laurent Bavay.
Hungarianologist.
Pardon me. Laurent Bavay of the oil and gas industry. I apologize.
Italyologist.
It was your LinkedIn page that I referred to on this podcast. If you're listening, I apologize for getting you confused with Laurent Bavay of Egyptology fame.
Madagascarologist.